Andy McDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister has said on innumerable occasions that the UK has a robust export licensing regime. And many of us on this side of the House are not satisfied with that response. So will he please finally tell us what the legal advice is as to whether this country is in compliance with our obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure that those arms are not used to commit offences in Gaza?
Well, Mr Speaker, he really shouldn't expect me to make a different point from this dispatch box. Having set out the position of the government, that is the position of the government, and that is what I will reiterate. And in respect of his question about the arms export licensing and the application of international humanitarian law, I set out the government's position very clearly in my response to the Shadow Foreign Secretary. And, Mr Speaker, I have nothing further to add to that at this time.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Israeli Minister Benny Gantz is the only person to have been granted a special mission status certificate by the Foreign Office since the beginning of last year, effectively protecting him from arrest for his part in suspected breaches of international law. According to reports, Israel did not grant Gantz's delegation official status. So, Mr Speaker, can the Minister explain why the UK government still chose to provide diplomatic cover for this individual?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, whatever the position of the Israeli government, let me assure him that Benny Gantz was received in this country. He was seen by the Foreign Secretary and his visit was most welcome.
Andy McDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To any reasonable and informed observer, the conduct of the war in Gaza by Israel contravenes basic international humanitarian law in failing to distinguish between armed combatants and civilians, in using force beyond what is militarily necessary, offends against the prohibition of inflicting unnecessary injury, and is wholly disproportionate. Over 100,000 Palestinians have now been killed or injured by Israeli forces in Gaza since last October. So whilst the Minister relies on Israel being a democracy capable of abiding by its legal obligations, when the overwhelming evidence is that it is not doing so, what legal advice has he received about the complicity of and the dangers to our country of failing to take sufficient action under the relevant treaties to which this country is a signatory to deter such gross breaches of international humanitarian law?
Minister.
Well, as I said, Mr Speaker, we do continue to assess Israel's commitment and capability to comply with international humanitarian law. Those assessments are supported by a detailed evidence base, conflict analysis, reporting from charities and NGOs, international bodies and partner countries, statements and reports by the Israeli government and their track record of compliance. And we take all of that into account in making the judgments we make. But I would point out to him that when it comes to targeting, when it comes to military action, the Israeli Defence Force has its own lawyers embedded in those units and in much the same way of prudence that the British military do. That is not something which you see in any other force in the region, and it should give some confidence that they are seeking to abide by international humanitarian law.